Hello and welcome back to the Summer Day Studios YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at how you can take your plastic materials from looking new and kind of factory fresh like this to much more worn, beat up, and kind of used like this. So you might be thinking, why would we want to do that? Why do we want to make our materials look more beat up? Well, it could simply just be because you want this to look more weathered, like it's been around the block a few times and it's not fresh off the factory floor. But also there's another underlying reason for it, and that's because oftentimes with CG renders, one of the things that gives away that it is a CG render is that it looks too fresh, it looks too perfect, it looks too computer generated, hence the name. So one of the things we can do as 3D artists with our materials is that we can rough them up a bit. We can make them look a little bit more worn, a little bit more realistic, because even if something is fresh off the factory floor, it might not necessarily be without any sort of blemishes whatsoever. It probably has some tiny little details that the eye will pick up on, and if we don't put those in our models to some degree, whether that's to a greater or lesser extent, you're going to be able to notice it. So I'm going to show you how you can use a few different nodes in Maya with the Arnold renderer, but this should apply to any other renderer as well. The nodes will just have different names and they might plug into slightly different areas, but the principles are the same: how to rough up your models and make them look a little bit more realistic and less new and CG. So I'm going to be using this little Game Boy model that I have here because it's a pretty good TEF subject with a lot of different curves and angles and corners to look at. And also this is going to be mainly focusing on plastics today, but you can apply this same principle to most other materials. The weathering might just look a little bit different, so keep that in mind. So I've already gone ahead and applied an open PBR surface material. I've just called that new underscore material, and I've given it a bit of a blue color and added a little bit of metalness just to make it look somewhat metallic, but you don't have to do that. I'm just going for like kind of like a fake metallic-y plastic that some of these old Game Boys kind of had at the time. I'm also using a sky dome light, which I created from the Arnold tab with an HDRI plugged in. I would highly recommend that you do that for this tutorial, because if you don't, we're not going to be able to see the reflections quite as well, and we're not going to be able to see the roughness that you add to your model in the material quite as well if you were to just use a basic light, a flat light. So I'd highly recommend that you go ahead and do that before we get started. So with that basic material applied, if I just go ahead and render this, we'll take a look at what it looks like. So I'll zoom in and you can see we've got this nice kind of electric, bright blue, old school looking material on here right now. And it's got some metallic kind of ness to it, but it's largely going to replicate a plastic material. And you can see it looks incredibly clean, almost too clean and too perfect. Okay, even if this was just a brand new Game Boy, it's probably not going to be this perfect. It might at least have some fingerprints or, you know, the occasional little smudge somewhere or some specks or something like that, right? Nothing stays clean like that unless you had this in a literal vacuum. So how can we rough this up? Well, I'm going to just pause the render for the time being, and I'm going to open up the Hypershade editor. And I'm going to select my material from up here. I've got new underscore matte, and then I'm just going to press this button to graph it so we can see it. So right now, this has a lot of different inputs, and there's only a few that we really need to pay attention to in order to make this look a lot more rough. One of the first things we can do is rough up that specular a little bit, because as you can see on the shadable here, it's looking very, very kind of perfectly shiny in all directions, which is never going to happen, especially if something has been used a little bit. So let's go ahead and create a file node, a file texture node in this case. And in here, with the texture node, I'm going to use some surface breakup materials, or surface imperfection texture maps. And one of the best places you can get those from is a website called Ambient CG. They have all kinds of free textures. If you go to surfaces and then just type in something like surface, that's going to show you all the different surface imperfections you have. And I've downloaded a bunch of these. So we've got everything from scratches, which we're going to use today, to kind of just general scuffs and smudges, handprints as well, dirt, grime, coffee stains, all kinds of things. So go ahead and download a couple of these that make sense. For plastic, I would generally say something a bit scratchy is good. And maybe some scuffs and grunge like this as well that we can combine together with those scratches to make a more complete looking material. So I would say with the resolution that you want to download for these, it's going to depend on your project. You could go with 4K if you're going to be seeing this thing a little bit more up close. If it's going to be a bit further back, you might go 2K. If it's really far away, you might want to avoid doing this whole thing altogether, because then you're not really going to see it that much and it won't matter. But for a close-up shot, like we're doing today, I've gone ahead and downloaded the 4K textures. Feel free to do the same as well. But if you want to use lower resolution, that's okay too. It will still work, but just keep in mind it might be a little bit more blurry. I generally like to go for PNG because you need transparency sometimes for these sort of materials. You can also go JPEG, that will work just fine, but just my preference is to go with PNG. Once we've got those downloaded, I'm going to select our fire texture back in the node graph, and I'm going to click this button here. Then I'm just going to go ahead and navigate to where I have kept all of my materials. I've stored them in this handy little surface imperfection section, and then I'm going to go ahead and select my scratches material. Now with this particular one and any other material here, what you're looking for is a black and white texture map like this. You can barely see this here because the textures, the scratches are really fine, but you can see the actual, the background is black, whereas the scratches are white. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and open this, and that's now gonna apply this to the node. Essentially what this is gonna tell our material is that the black parts are to remain shiny, or perfectly shiny, whereas the white parts are to become a lot more rough, right? So you can already kind of imagine how that's going to look when we apply this to our model. There's a few little things we need to do first, which is change the color space from sRGB to utility and then raw. Okay, we don't want a color corrected color space for this. We want this to be completely raw data so that there's no chance of anything going wrong when we plug this into our material here. Next, we're going to tick alpha is luminance, and the reason for that is because we're actually not going to be taking any color information from this, even though this is black and white. Essentially, what this material is going to tell us is the luminance values is what's going to be driving the roughness, as in how bright something is. So the white parts are obviously brighter than the darker parts, so we want to tell Maya that the alpha output, okay, of this node is going to be the luminance, and therefore it's going to drive the roughness of the material rather than the actual color. Okay, we'll get more into that in a second. We're going to click on this little plus arrow underneath the color because we don't want all the color, okay? And we wouldn't be able to plug this in anyway. You can see if I try to do that, a lot of these gray out, and this particular one here, specular roughness that we need, grays out, so we can't use that. We're just going to take the out color red. You can also take the out color green or blue. It doesn't really matter. You can also just use the alpha as well. I generally like to take out color red. There's no harm in picking any of those in particular, but red is just my preference. Again, we don't want color information from this, so that's why we're just taking the out color red. Okay, if you imagine instead of black and white, it had very, very deep red and then very, very bright red. We're just taking the luminance, okay, the brightness difference. We're just going to be driving the roughness. If I then come back and render this now, one thing that we're going to see is our model is now going to be incredibly shiny. And that is normal, don't worry. The reason why that's happened is because the majority of this texture map is black. Only a few small parts of it are white. And you might just be able to see here, we're starting to get some of these scratchies in parts of the model. Obviously it's very, very shiny right now. It looks like glossy plastic. That's not what we want. We want this to look a little bit more muted. So there's a couple of different ways we can do that, but one of the best ways to do that, I think, is to use a color correction node. So I'm going to just disconnect this for the time being. I'm going to type in AI color correct. Now, AI, by the way, does not stand for artificial intelligence. We've had a few people mention why we're using AI. We're not. It is just something to do with Arnold. I don't know why they decided to call it that, but that's just how it is. So I'm going to take the out color and put that in the input, okay? And you might be thinking, why are we taking the out color now from this file node into the color correct, whereas before we were just doing the out color red? That's because this is a color correction node. We need the full color of this texture. We're then going to go ahead and take the out color red from the color correct and put that in the specular roughness, okay? The important thing to remember is that the final part of the chain of nodes here, we just take out the luminance, as in the alpha, or just one of the color channels. We want all the color from this file is because the color correct is actually going to be editing this, and we're going to need all the information put into it, right? So our render is still going. But if I open up the attribute editor with our color correction node selected, and I start increasing the exposure of this, maybe let's up it to something 5, a lot more drastic. You can see all of a sudden we have a bunch of scratches on our model and it's looking way more rough. That's because the exposure, the brightness value of this texture has now been drastically increased. Generally, when you want to change that, I would say use the exposure. But with this kind of thing, unless you're going for something that's really beat up, less is more generally. So we might start with 1 and then see what that looks like. Maybe that won't be enough. But you can see even just by adding 1 here, we're getting a few more scratches and it's looking a little bit more interesting. The other thing we can do as well is there's a section down here called Add. Now, if I were to up this, it's going to, you see, remove some of the overall kind of reflectivity of this. The add section is kind of like raising that background level of the image. You know, there was a black part of that and there's a white part for the scratches. Well, this is going to raise that black part up to a kind of more of a mid-gray. And by doing that, you can see the rest of the model has become a little bit more matte, which is a bit more in line with our original material. And by doing that, this is now looking a lot more interesting. It's kind of got our base shininess that we had, that we wanted for that plastic material, but it's maintained those scratches that we added earlier. And now if we wanted to, we could, you know, ramp up the exposure and make these scratches really, really bright. This might be a little bit too much though. This looks like it's been thrown around in gravel or something like that. We're just trying to rough it up a little bit, okay? Like it's been used and kind of loved and played with. What we can now do is these scratches, I do like this, but I feel like they're looking a little bit too big. So one thing we can do is we can come back to the Hypershade editor, click on this little place 2D texture node here, and this allows us to adjust something called the repeat UV. By default, this is 1. Okay, and all that means is that the UV, the texture in particular, our texture file, if I go ahead and open this guy up, this image repeats once, so it covers the entire UV shell. Okay, if I were to say change this to 2, it means it's now going to repeat twice. Okay, so it's going to reduce in size, right? If you think the more that repeats and the more it stretches, it means the more often the scratches are going to appear in that UV shell, the smaller this is going to get. So if I was to go ahead and increase this to something like 5, that means this is now 5 times smaller, and it's going to be harder for us to see some of the scratches, but they're looking a lot more kind of minimal. Now, they're not quite as big as they were, so kind of adjust that to your liking, and it will depend on the size of your UVs, which you will need for this method, by the way, and the kind of size of the scratches you want to go for. I'm going to go maybe with something more like 2. I don't want these to be too enormous. Okay, so that's cool, but how can we rough this up a little bit more and say have more than just scratches? Well, we can come back to our Hypershade editor and I can disconnect this color correct, okay? And what we're going to do is we're actually going to duplicate this. I'm going to select the color correct node, come up to edit, go to duplicate and duplicate shading network. If you just did without network, that's just going to duplicate the color correct. Duplicate with shading network is going to duplicate the entire network of things that's connected to this node. So that's what you generally want to do, unless you just want one part of this duplicated. I'm then going to take another material. I have this nice smudge one here that I've also got from Ambient CG, I believe. And again, we're looking for that black and white texture. And you can see here it's changed the color space back to sRGB. We want to just change that to raw like before. And it has maintained our repeat UV as 2, so just keep that in mind. If you want this to be less, you're going to have to adjust this because we've duplicated it, it's copied the values. But how do we combine these two together? Well, we can press tab and type in composite, AI composite, and this is going to composite those two materials together. We just have to plug the out color from that into B and then this one into A. Okay, and again, we're using the out color, like we said, only the last node in the chain has to give us that alpha or just out color red, green or blue. I'm going to change the operation from over to multiply. Okay, the reason being is because over generally doesn't apply that much of a nice combination. It doesn't composite them too nicely together, I think, whereas multiply kind of seamlessly blends the materials a little better, at least in my experience. But feel free to try that out and see if either of those work better for you. I'm then going to go ahead and create another AI color correct node, but we can also just duplicate that one and plug that in. And then we're going to take the out color red and plug that into the specular roughness. One thing to keep in mind is because we've duplicated all these color corrects, we've got this add here in all of these. I'm going to take these back in the first two and just reduce the add because we're already getting that from this one. okay, at the end. And this is also applying more exposure. So bear in mind, the reason why we have these color corrects in this order is because this one allows us to adjust this specific scratch material. This one allows us to adjust this specific smudge material. This one allows us to adjust them all at once. So it gets a little bit more complicated. You don't have to do it exactly this way. This is just how I like to do it. But if we come back to Maya, you can see it's actually looking a bit softer. That's just a side effect of the composite node, but don't worry, we can go ahead and fix that by selecting that last color correct, and then maybe bumping the exposure up to something like 4. And again, this will vary based on your model and the lighting and the material you're making, but you can see now we're getting some of that scratchiness back, but we're also getting some of those smudges in as well, which just makes the material look a bit more interesting. If you're trying to make a battered material like this, generally layering up materials like this is kind of better. I would say at least have 2, just because it's rare that wear and tear on a material is exactly one type of thing, right? You might not just have scratches. You're probably going to have some scuffs as well, where some of the material is worn down. Maybe you've got some greasy fingers on it because you've been eating Cheetos while you're playing with your Game Boy, something like that, right? So combine them when you can. One of the last things that we can do now is add a bit of bump. You know, let's assume there's these corners here, and I used to have a Game Boy, and I remember that over time you kind of get some dents in these corners. So how can we go ahead and do that? Well, let's open up our Hypershade editor again, and I'm going to press tab again. I'm going to type in AI bump 2D. Okay. Now, if you've ever used normal maps before, that's essentially what this is, except it's a bump node, and it's going to allow us to use nodes and shaders and materials which aren't texture files. We're going to use some procedural noise to do this, just because it's going to be a little bit more convenient for this. You don't have to do it this way. You could also use texture files if you wanted to. That will work similarly, but for today's tutorial we're just going to use some noise. I'm going to plug the out value of this into the normal camera, and for the time being that's going to do absolutely nothing because we don't have any inputs in this. It's kind of like the color correct. If we didn't have anything plugged into the color correct, nothing would happen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a noise texture. I'm going to come up to 2D textures here on the left and just create a regular noise that comes built in with Maya. And I'm going to take the out color red again because we just want the luminance from this. Remember, we don't want the whole RGB. And we're going to plug that into the bump map. Okay, and if we come back to Maya, you're probably going to see that not a whole lot has happened. Again, that's because the frequency or the amount of detail this repeats, similarly to our place 2D texture node, you know, where we had to increase that to 2, it's not high enough. We need to increase it. You can see some of this bumpiness going on over there, but it looks a bit weird. It's not quite big enough. So what I'm going to do to increase that is I'm going to bump up the frequency ratio from 2 to maybe 10, something like that. You can now see we're getting a lot more bumpiness on this, but this is looking like someone's melted it in a microwave, and it's not exactly what we want, right? This is not the kind of plastic we're going for. We just want this on the corners. So I might go ahead and just reduce the amplitude slightly. The reason being is because if you don't, you're going to get patches where we don't have any bumpiness, which we do want, but I'd rather have a bit more control over where we do that. Next, what I'm going to do is adjust the size randomness, and doing that will make it so that each bump on this has a various different sizes. Okay, it's going to randomize the size of those little nodules because nothing in life is perfectly even generally. Even when we make it to be so, under a microscope it won't be. And we're trying to introduce some randomness to this, okay? If we had it look too uniform, it would look a bit too CG and weird. I also like to reduce the density for this specific technique because we don't want bumps absolutely everywhere. So I might reduce that down to, let's try 0.4, see what that looks like. That's maybe still a little too many. Let's reduce it down to like, I don't know, 0.1 or something. And then we'll just let that render a little bit. And you can see now we're getting way less density. We're kind of just getting bumps in a few different places, but it's not covering the entire model. There's a lot of gaps. One thing you might notice now is that these bumps look like they're protruding out of the model rather than going in like a dent should. And that's because currently, if we go back to the Hypershade editor, the bump height is set to 0.1 in the positive. Now, again, this needs to go in, so we want this to be negative. So we're going to put a minus there. If we now come back and let that render for a second, you can already see that it looks like these are now denting into the model. Currently it looks like someone's trying to eat it. There's sort of teeth marks everywhere, which could feasibly be something that happens if you're really angry at your Game Boy, but we want these to be specifically on the corners. So how do we do that? Well, there's another way that we can do this, and it's using a few different nodes. So I'm going to unplug this for the time being. Okay, I'm going to create something called an AI mix shader. This is kind of similar to the composite shader, but it gives you a little bit more control. It's just combining two different materials in a different way. I'm going to take the out color from this noise, and I'm going to go ahead and plug it into shader 2. And then I'm going to type in AI flat. And a flat is just a blank color, basically. There's not a whole lot you can see to this node. It's very simple in compared to everything else. And I'm going to make this black because we want this to be no bumpiness whatsoever. You remember the background color of these is black, meaning nothing happens. If we were to make this white, it would mean it would be, you know, about as bumpy as it can be. So we want this to be black, right? And I'm going to plug the out color of this into shader 1. And then I'm going to take the out color red again from the mix shader, last node in the chain. We just want the out color red, or the alpha or green or blue, just one channel, and we're going to plug that into the bump. If we come back to our Maya, you can see the render's updated, nothing's changed. That's because there's an extra little node here on the mix shader that we don't have on the composite node called mix, hence the name of the shader. Whatever we plug into this mix shader is going to tell Maya how to apply this material. So we can get really creative with how we let Maya apply these two different materials, right? We could use a texture map, or we could use a noise, or we could use something called a curvature node. We're going to do AI curvature. And we're going to take the out color red again from this because we just want the luminance information. And we'll select that node and we'll come back to Maya. And we'll let that update for a second. And you can see your nice bump has effectively disappeared. And that's because we need to adjust some of these settings. If I go ahead and increase the radius here from something like 0.1 up to maybe 0.5, and then we'll let that render for a minute. You can now see that we're only getting that bumpiness on the corner of the model, right? We're not getting it so much around the middle part. We're only really getting it on the corners of things. And you can see it really nicely along these surfaces here, kind of where you'd expect it more to be, right? On corners that stick out away from things. You're probably not going to have too many dents in the center here. The reason for that is this curvature node, hence the name, is kind of looking at the way your model is built, right? And it's assuming, or not assuming, sorry, it's taking into account the shape. So if something is flat, it's saying, okay, we're not looking at that area, but if something is curved or angles down like this, that is where this node comes in. It starts to look at these corners and these curves and says, okay, hey, once we plug this into the mix, only go ahead and apply this to the parts where there is curvature on the corners, not the flat surfaces. And you can adjust how much that's affected. Here, if I was to increase the spread up to like, I don't know, 1.4 and let that render for a second, you're going to see we're starting to get a lot more bumpiness on the flat surfaces as well, because it's spreading away from the corners. But generally, if you're going for this specific look where it's on the corners, you're going to want a lower radius value. And there's a few other settings you can play with, but they're not too important for this particular tutorial. So there you have it. That's just a few little nodes. It really didn't take too much time at all. And we've already created a much more interesting looking material, something that looks a little bit more worn and beat up, not quite as perfect to the eye. And it doesn't look anywhere near as CG, right? Because no material generally is perfect, even when it's first off the factory floor. So that's how you can beat up your plastic materials, make them look a bit more realistic. Add some weathering in Maya with Arnold. Let me know if you have any questions at all in the comment section. If you have any suggestions as well, we always love to hear those. Thank you very much for watching, and like and subscribe. Till next time, I'll see you later. Bye-bye.